more and more people are becoming aware of systemic problems, I suppose. But it has to be, it's all part of a multi-stage process of coming to terms and realising that, something is rotten in the state of Denmark, as Hamlet had it. I mean, more broadly, I suppose, it's been repeatedly pointed out in recent years, in the last couple of years, that if governments can grab extra power in the event of an emergency, and put that emergency in inverted commas, then governments will get a taste for declaring emergencies, or at least persuading enough people that they're living through an emergency so as to justify that government in grabbing even more power. Talk about a vicious circle. Anyone in any doubt about the viciousness of the circle need only look to the east, as I mentioned earlier, and to what's happening now in the benighted Holy Land, a land supposedly holy to Judaism, Christianity and Islam. But it's not a good place at the moment. I say it's obvious now, blatantly obvious, that we the people are being presented cynically, I would say cynically, with one emergency after another, each one demonstrably more frightening than the last, more upsetting, more discombobulating. And at the same time, the government, indeed, all the governments of the West, supposing the West even means anything anymore, those governments have successfully gained more and more power. As a result, just as we the people have seen our freedoms, our rights, standards of living, our mental and physical well-being even compromised and reduced. And as always, especially in this podcast series, as always we say there's nothing new under the sun. It's happened before. It's always been this way. The Romans, God love them, got rid of their last king in 509 BC, 509 years before the birth of Jesus Christ. And, thereafter, the Republic, as it was no longer a monarchy, it was a republic. It was governed by two consuls, two men, two officials who were elected every year. And built into that system of the Republic, in the event of an emergency, was the role of dictator. And, dictator has specific connotations for us that it didn't have then. It became that way. We have dictator as a pejorative, really. We don't generally describe or declare that we like dictators. But it was different in its initial iteration. A dictator in that early Roman Republic could bypass the normal rules of the Republic and the Senate with a view to dealing with a crisis, a short-term, a war, typically. And a dictator so raised had a limited term of office. And after the term, and let's say he might be put in place and given 6 months to fix the problem at the most. And after that period of time, he had to stand down, and he could also even be liable for prosecution depending on how he performed and what he'd actually done while acting as dictator. And in the end, the human species being as it is, and human nature being as it is, the role of dictator was abused. Surprise, surprise. Spectacularly, Julius Caesar was declared, let's imagine he declared himself dictator perpetuo. I think we can all understand what's meant by that. Dictator forever. Guess what? He was murdered. And after that, the office of dictator was never revived. Not as far as I know. Not in Rome. In its original concept, though, the role was about centralising decision-making during a war. And it was also very much about crushing civil unrest. That was the last thing that the Senate wanted, was a rising from the proles and the people. And it's worth noting that during the Republic, centuries of the Republic, the office of dictator was seldom abused in actual fact. And when it finally was abused in a way that was finally unacceptable, then the role was done away with altogether and forever. But of course, getting rid of the office of dictator didn't stop the slide into authoritarianism, which is a process as perennial as the growing of the grass. Hence the descent from the republic to empire and the absolute rule of Caesars and the rest. Declaring emergencies for the sake of gaining power has been a habit of the power-hungry ever since. The entirety of the Third Reich in Germany in the 1930s and 40s, all 12 years of it, till it was done away with by the Russians and by the Allies in 1945. For all of that time, it operated in a state of emergency declared by Hitler and his Nazis as soon as possible after they got into office. Abuse of emergency powers was also how despots took root in African countries in recent times, and it's how China has fallen under the rule of another sort of perpetual dictator, one after another, and in position for life to all intents and purposes. And the powers that be invariably say that they have to declare emergencies and assume emergency power from time to time to hold at bay national panic, chaos. In other words, in terms that are familiar to all of us now, they declare a state of emergency for our own good, to save us from ourselves, you might say. Hitler used the Reichstag fire in 1933 to push through the enabling law that let him bypass the German parliament and rule by personal decree. And armed with the powers of the enabling law, he ran roughshod over civil rights. He banned political opposition. There could be no party but the Nazi party. He took control of the media, of the press. He increased censorship. He closed down something like 1,600 newspapers in Germany. And he opened Dachau, the first of the concentration camps, originally to cope with the rapidly growing number of people declared undesirable and therefore dangerous by the Nazi regime. And all of it was done under the guise of protecting the people and, of course, the people's democracy. It was all, and it always is, bollocks. Pardon my French. What it was about, what it's always about, is frightened, greedy, power-crazed bullies abusing the law of the land to make themselves safe from challenge, far less the prospect of being removed from power. And now look at where we are. Rewind 3 years and a so-called pandemic brought about a worldwide state of emergency from which we have never meaningfully been set free, and from which we won't be set free. Not by them. We will only be free if and when we declare that we are free for ourselves and by ourselves. And after disease, that familiar horse of the apocalypse, came war, one of its faithful travelling companions, which is to say war in Ukraine. Death is all around, of course, that third horse of the apocalypse. And it should come as no surprise, therefore, that famine, completing the set of four, is increasingly being predicted for the years or perhaps even the months ahead. That conflict in Ukraine, 500,000 dead Ukrainians and counting, and who knows how many dead Russians, didn't play out the way the West wanted. Or maybe it did. You know, who could imagine how Machiavellian the whole situation might be? Maybe it did. Maybe it has played out the way it was supposed to. I don't even know anymore. But in any event, war in Ukraine has been replaced by war in the Middle East. And anyone my age knows that that's a species of war that we in the West have been bred to dread like no other, because of all of its spiritual connotations apart from anything else. Then, of course, back at the turn of the millennium, 9/11, perhaps the two most infamous numbers in recent history, brought the US government of George W. Bush the grounds for a state of emergency and the justification for the so-called war on terror. And that went well, didn't it? War on terror. War on terror. And in every way that matters, that war has never ended. And I would ask, who in their right mind thinks you can make war on terror anyway? You might as well make war on the passage of time. And look at the lineage of terrorist organisations in recent memory. The Mujahideen, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, one after another, and all keeping us fearful and willing to accept or have us submit to more and more surveillance from our governments back home, more and more invasions of our privacy, more and more erosion of our rights, more and more restrictions on our movements, more and more damage to economies. The Roman Republic 2,500 years ago came up with the role of dictator as a response to war. But they had the sense to place checks in the way of those dictators, a time limit on the existence of each dictator. But now we look back over the history within living memory and we see nothing but war. Nothing but opportunities for arms companies to make money, obscene amounts of money, and for governments to take and hold ever-increasing power. Nothing but the steady growth of authoritarianism, totalitarianism, and that's dictatorship by any other name. And always, with the passing years, the ante must be upped. And so, 2 decades into the 21st century, we're being invited to contemplate and to fear the mother of all wars, perhaps global nuclear war, sparked by horror and growing more horrible by the day. And all around us, it's fear and anxiety about disease, about the climate, about money and the lack of it for most of us, about war after war after war. And perhaps most pernicious of all, most wearying and damaging, we are increasingly fragmented as people, atomised, driven into smaller and smaller, mutually suspicious groups and enclaves, divided into this opposing group or that, always, and for one reason or another, set at one another's throats. I say that we need to have the courage to look up from all of it and see the real problem, the real enemy. And the real enemy are our governments. It's not about left and right. It's not about religion. It's not about gay or straight or trans. It's not about race. It's about wrong and right. And most of all, it's about a very shallow layer on top. And shallow or not, it's crushing down upon all of us on the bottom. And the fight back has to be from the bottom up until finally we push their boots off our faces. As always, first and foremost, before anything else, we must ask ourselves the same question. The question is, who benefits? Who gains? Who has gained from all of this? And always gains, regardless of the emergency, regardless of the increasing hardship of the many. Who benefits? And in answer to that question, all I can really say is, not me, and not mine. We're not doing better, and I suspect that that's true for almost all of you too.